22 tells us, by faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instruction about his bones. It's kind of interesting that out of all the things Joseph experienced, the author of Hebrews is looking at the narrative of the entire life of Joseph, but then he focuses on what would be the best place where faith was visible in Joseph. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, he spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. So he spoke, he testified concerning the exodus. And then, by faith, he gave instruction about his bones. So these are the two things that we want to focus. Hebrews 11:22, the author of Hebrews, interprets Genesis 50:24 through 25 narrative for us. That's where he finds of this man, Joseph. And that will help us to understand what faith is. Joseph entered into the Bible. God revealed to him through a dream that he will actually be ruling, including his family. Now, his father was very displeased with that, yet he kept what Joseph said in his heart because he knew that was from God. But from that point on, Joseph, after receiving this dream about his future, from that point on, his life continued spiral downward. Finally, after long years, he is raised up and he identifies himself as Joseph. So by the time we come toward the end of Genesis, we think that he made it. He went through a lot of hardship, but finally, when he became successful, when his dream was fulfilled, he was able to forgive his brother. Some people might say, well, that was easy for Joseph to forgive because after he became successful and everything was just fine, it would have been much easier to forgive his brothers. However, Joseph was able to release this unforgiving spirit when he realized his own suffering had a greater purpose. Therefore, being in an ideal situation is not necessary for forgiving others. Sometimes it's very hard for us to forgive other people because of somebody else. I'm in this situation and we blame other people, and it's very hard for us to forgive. But that was not the case for Joseph. He saw the greater purpose, what God was doing in his life, using everything that went through, both good and bad, and God's sovereign hand was on Joseph. And because of that, one does not need an ideal situation. Joseph forgave his brothers because he saw a greater purpose in suffering, not because he achieved success in life. Now that reminds us of the cross, because Jesus Christ was crucified. The justice was suspended. People were shouting, "Crucify him." It was the most awful sin that the people can commit by crucifying the Son of God. However, Jesus Christ, when he was crucified, if you remember, he said, "Father, they do not know what they're doing. Forgive them." Why was this spirit of forgiveness? Why was Jesus able to forgive those people? Because the suffering had a greater purpose. The cross, what he was going through, that was going to accomplish the greatest salvation of mankind. That's why he was able to pray, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." So therefore, by looking to the cross, Christ's suffering, one can overcome the unforgiving spirit. One understands as the person is going through a tough time, but still able to forgive. Why? Because looking at the cross, there is always greater purpose than the suffering itself. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid. I want you to think about this. And take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But as you know, when you come to Genesis chapter 50, they still got a long way to go. You know, this is a little bit strange because Joseph said to his brothers, he said, I'm going to die, but God's going to come to your aid and take you up out of this land. Isn't it interesting? It will take 400 years for the Exodus to actually take place. Yet, this man, Joseph, said, he will come to your aid. Even though he knew from his father, and Jacob knew from his father Isaac, and Isaac knew from his father Abraham, it will take 400 years. Now, why did he say it? It is very important for us to think about this. When everything was right, and he has his children, and his grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, he was able to. Even though he was successful, even though he knew that the Exodus would not take place until 400 years later, he knew. He always had in mind that the place where he was not his permanent home. And he is reminding his brothers, even though you will live here and you will be very prosperous, but this is not our home. And we must always have that in mind. Otherwise, we will lose the sight of God's promise. We will lose, when we're living comfortably, we lose the sight of this God. For this reason, Joseph told his brother that God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What we find here is that God always keeps his promise. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear on oath and said, God will surely come to your aid again. To your aid. And then you must carry my bones up from this place. It will be a long time being buried in Egypt for 400 years. He didn't ask his brothers, I want to be buried where my father, our father, was buried. He probably knew once he died that his family will not have that type of privilege as what they are enjoying now. He knew that the pleasure and the prosperity will not always last forever. He probably knew. And almost prophetically, that happened. Shortly after Joseph died, a new Pharaoh arose, and who did not know Joseph. Now the Hebrew people were suffering and were slaves in Egypt. So he knew. So he knew that his body will be buried in Egypt. But nevertheless, when God comes to the rescue, when there's going to be an exodus, he wanted to make sure that his bone will be carried out to the promised land. It is likely that Joseph's mention of the Exodus made the Israelites feel extremely uncomfortable. Why? Because Joseph is talking about this Exodus, that this is not our home. God's going to come and take us out. At that time, I'm sure they were saying to each other, why this Exodus? Why Exodus is needed? Egypt is much better than Canaan. We're enjoying this prosperity. I'm sure they felt very uncomfortable when they heard Joseph told them about this Exodus. I said, why is it necessary? It's better to stay in Egypt. Joseph wanted to remind the people that this is not where we belong. And he talked about the Exodus, the salvation. He talked about God will come to his people. With the passing of time, the Israelites facing hardship under a new Pharaoh, Joseph testifying the Exodus would have instilled hope in them. At that time, they did not know, but as they were going through this hardship, they were longing for this Exodus. For the next 400 years, what Joseph said, what Jacob said, what Isaac and Abraham said, they took that very seriously. Why? Because of the situation they're in, suffering in Egypt. They were longing for that Exodus. If they continued to live comfortably, they would not long for God's salvation. But because what they were going through, now what Joseph said made sense. And using what Joseph said, and they continued to have hope in this Exodus. By testifying to God's fulfillment of his promise through Christ's death, brings hope to this dying world. Isn't that true? Just as the Israelites, as they were suffering, the only hope they had was God will come to the rescue. Likewise, by testifying like Joseph to God's fulfillment of his promise through Christ's death, it will bring hope to this dying world. Exodus 13:19 and Joshua 24:32 serve as a reminder of God's faithfulness. After 400 years, Moses took Joseph's bone or mummy out of Egypt. That's what we find in Exodus 13:19. And when we come to Joshua 24:32, actually Joshua buried Joseph's bone. So in a way, what Joseph had asked after 400 years was fulfilled. What does that mean for us? The Exodus was not something Joseph experienced. That happened 400 years later. However, while the first generation who experienced the Exodus, ironically, they all died during 40 years in the wilderness, Joseph's bones were buried in the promised land. Isn't that interesting? They came out of Egypt, but that they all died in the wilderness, anyone who was over 20. On the other hand, Joseph never experienced the Exodus, but yet his bones were buried in the promised land. In other words, he saw the completion of the Exodus, how God was faithful to his promise. Even Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land, and his body, God buried him. Yet Joseph, his bones reached Canaan. This is what we find. For no matter how many promises God has made, they are yes in Christ. Now think about that. What does that mean? It means all of God's promises are fulfilled in Christ, especially through the cross and the resurrection. Therefore, to find assurance and hope, we must look to the cross where God fulfilled his promises through Christ. When we look at the cross, we realize that God is faithful. This is why Paul says God made many promises in the Old Testament for us. They're all accomplished and fulfilled in Christ. Through this story, we talked about mainly two things. Faith is really needed to forgive other people. Faith in Jesus Christ, who was crucified. The second thing that I highlighted, faith is necessary to testify, to bring hope to the people. What prevents us from yearning, desiring for the fulfillment of God's promise? This is a question for the Israelites. As they went through hardship, they were longing for God to fulfill his promise. In their pleasure, when their lives were good, what Joseph said made them extremely uncomfortable. Yet in their suffering, they were longing for God to come and deliver them. So the question that you and I have to ask is, what prevents us from yearning for the fulfillment of God's promise? What will keep us? What prevents us from having a forgiving spirit? Why do we have a hard time forgiving other people? These are the two things that we want to consider through this study. It takes faith to forgive other people. It takes faith to long for God's promise to be fulfilled. Rather than look at our situation, we receive great comfort as we're looking at the cross. Reminds us that God is faithful to his promise. God will surely come to the rescue and deliver us.